So I'm going to start this out with a statement, and you can write this down if you feel the need, or maybe you can just commit this to memory. And what I'm going to say is that the notes of a chord are what determine the chord, and the order of the notes is irrelevant. So that's an important thing for you to understand. The notes of a chord make up a chord. The order of the notes is irrelevant. So we're going to study chord inversions, and as you can see here, I have a C major scale written out, a 1-octave C major scale, and as I pretty much always do, I have the notes of the scale numbered for any of you who may not be familiar with using numbers. I have the number 1 here to represent the C note as the first note in the scale. And I also have written underneath the numbers whether the scale tone chords associated with this scale are major or minor. And what we have here essentially represents the key of C major. So what I want to do is I want to start out by taking a look at the C major chord. And the way that we have come to recognize the C major chord is the notes C, E, and G. And this is kind of how we've always represented the chord. And I want to just sort of analyze what we have here with respect to the scale. What we have is we start with the C note, and that's the root note of our chord. So I'm just going to put a 1 under there just to indicate that the C is the root note of the chord. And then we proceed to the E note, and the E note is higher in pitch than the C note. The C is the root note. The E is higher in pitch than the root note, and it's also the third note of the scale. So I'm going to put a 3 there. And finally, we have the G note, and the G note is higher in pitch than either of the C or the E. And because G is the 5th note of the scale, I'm going to write the number 5 in here. So this is the way that we have represented the C note, or excuse me, the C chord so far. We started with the root note, and it's the lowest note of our chord. And then we proceed upward pitch-wise to the E note. And then we proceed upwards from there to the G note. However, this is not the only way that we can represent a C chord. And what we could do, if we wanted to, is we could decide to make the E note the lowest note of the chord. So now we have the root note. However, the root note is higher in pitch than the other 2 notes. And when we switch the notes around like this, we create what's known as an inversion. So what we have is we have an inversion of a C major chord. We're not starting using our root note as the lowest note of the chord. We started with the E note as our lowest note, and then we just proceeded upwards until we found the G, and then this octave C to get our notes to the chord. And what if we wanted to start our chord on the note G? Okay, so let's say we decide to make G the lowest note of a chord. So now we have the E note that's beyond the C. It's higher in pitch than the C note. So the notes of our chord are G, C, E. And of course, E is the 3rd note of the scale. So now I'm going to represent that with the number 3. So now I want to take a closer look at these chord inversions. And we're going to go back to the first C chord. C is our root note, and our root note is the lowest note of the chord. This is what's known as root position. Now let's look at what happens when we choose E as the first note of the chord. We have what's known as the first inversion. Let's take a look at it when we started it and we had the G as the lowest note of the chord. Well, when the notes are ordered this way, it's what's known as the second inversion. Okay, so this is the basic fundamental information. That brings me to the next level of understanding, because in reality, we have been working with chord inversions the whole time. We learned fingerings where our root notes were on the B string and where our root notes were on the E string, and then finally we went to our root notes being on the G string. Well, these different chord fingerings that we've been using are chord inversions. I want to kind of go back to the beginning to the first set of notes in the first set of chord fingerings that we learned. And those were our chords that had the root note on the B string. And what I want to do is I want to analyze the notes that we are playing. And I want to sort of analyze them with respect to from the lowest note to the highest note that we play. So this is our root note B string version of the chord. And as we can see, this is a second inversion. The note that we're playing on the G string is the fifth. And the note we're playing on the B string is the root note. And the note we are playing on the E string is the third. And this doesn't change. If we use any of these root note B string fingerings for a major chord, the note on the G string will be the fifth. The note on the B string will be the root, and the note on the E string will be the third. Now let's just say we played a C, let's just say we played a minor chord. Well, in a minor chord, the third is flatted. So for example, in a C minor chord, we would have E flat for our note instead of E. But what is important to understand is that if we had a minor chord, then the order of the notes, starting with the G string and working our way to the B string, would be, we would have the fifth on the G string, the root note on the B string, and then the note on the E string would be the flatted third. So now let's take a look at the second set of chords that we learned. And those were the ones that had the root note on the E string. So when our chords have their root notes on the E string, this is the inversion that we are playing. What I want you to try to get your head around with is that the note we are playing on the G string is now the third, the note that we are playing on the B string is the fifth, and the note that we are playing on the C string is the root note. So finally, let's take a look at the chords we've been playing that have their root notes on the G string. So these are the root position chords. And I'm just gonna take and write that over here. So what you can see is we have 3 separate fingerings, and each chord fingering represents an inversion. Now that we understand these terms and we understand that the chords that we are playing are inversions, now we can start to work to combine these different fingerings so that we can make our playing more interesting, and also so that we can make our playing easier. So put in your time, put in your work, and I hope to see you at the next lesson. Peace.